All right, it's been a long day. We've got a couple more talks, so I'm going to try to get the energy up so we can end the day strong. So let's jump into Nuxt server components. So I kind of came around this idea. If you've seen the other ecosystem out there on the React side, you may have heard of Nuxt, and you may have seen React server components. And that has been a big hot topic in that community over there. And I have been looking at that and saying, what parts of that React server components are we doing inside the Vue community? Because it's kind of a big deal. If you've seen Nuxt 13 or Nuxt 14, they have shifted the paradigm to this new, what they're calling the apps router. And the apps router uses server components by default. But I was really interested in what we're doing on the Nuxt side on this. So I did some research, and I found Daniel Rowe from the Nuxt, the core member from Nuxt, and he had told me about the Nuxt server components at a conference I was at just earlier this year. So I deep dived into it. I created a video on it, and I wanted to share my learnings with everybody here today and how you might want to use this new feature in the future. And so one thing I want to get straight right away is that React server components that you may have heard of is not the same as Nuxt server components or Vue server components. They're a completely different paradigm. So we're going to focus on, since this is a Vue conference, on the Nuxt side of it. Just realize on the React side, server components are almost by default, and then you have React server components, and then children of those are client components, while it's almost the opposite in the Nuxt side. And we'll look at that a little bit more. But I want to give a big warning before we get too far, is that we're going to be talking about experimental features here. So this is an experimental feature in Nuxt, meaning that it's not ready for prime time yet. But I want to see a show of hands. Who here has used experimental features? I think I see a few. Yeah? Yeah? I think I have used experimental features in the past. I have used it in production very, very, very rarely, though I have done it. But if you're like me, I also like to live dangerously. So I use experimental features. And I think it's a good way to learn about new features that are coming out. I know the core team loves when you use experimental features, especially if you can give feedback back to them about how they work, what you found that didn't work, any bugs. So I would highly recommend for you to do that. In fact, at the end of this talk, I'm going to show you a few other experimental features you might be wanting to look at inside Nuxt. So I keep using this word over and over again, Nuxt server components, and I haven't really defined it. So let's start off with the definition. Nuxt server components allow server-rendered individual components within your client-side app. And the most important part of that sentence is server rendering individual components, or server-rendered. So think of it the idea that your components now, instead of being rendered on the client side, or maybe in server SSR, or server-side rendered, or statically generated, you almost think these components are living on the server. So when they get rendered, they're on the server, and then the HTML and CSS gets shipped to the browser. And there's really, that's a part of it. So I think to understand this concept a little bit more, we need a deep dive into exactly what this means. So you're probably thinking like, oh, I've heard of this term, server components. What, is it the same as SSR? Are we just relabeling something? Or you guys may have heard of universal mode in Nuxt. Like, what is this? So server-side rendering, and I've used my great skills at creating graphs here using Excalidraw. But you can see here we have data is fetched. So the way it basically goes is your browser connects, the data is fetched, the server generates the page, it sends the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript back to the client pretty quickly. But then in the background, the browser displays the page right away, but in the background, the Nuxt.js hydrates in the background, meaning that the JavaScript, everything gets loaded. So you might have a fast paint time where you'll see the content quickly, but it may not be interactive right away because then the JavaScript's rendering in the background. So what about static site generation? So this is a similar concept, but this is during build time. Your pages all get generated. Once the browser connects, it just ships the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript back to the browser, and then the browser is active right away. So it does have this kind of build step where all the pages are created and they're all statically generated. And this is really kind of, this feels like the new, well, it's kind of the older way of, let me rephrase that. This is something that has been very popular recently with Jamstack and other technologies where people are saying we need very fast websites. It's great for SEO. So you might have seen this static site generation before. But it does have that extra build step that can take a while because it actually goes and builds everything and pulls everything in from all those pages. So let's look at server rendering. So in the server rendering side, if the data is fetched, the server generates the pages, it sends the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript back, and it's active. So then it just works that way. It kind of this server rendering, server components, and static site generation reminds me kind of like the PHP days where we have the data is loaded on the server, every single page is just a single HTML page and it gets passed in. And that's usually how web development was done a while back. So it feels like as we move forward, we're looking at the past and changing things up and taking some things we saw in the past that work well. But you can notice on this server rendering, there's no hydration step. And so there's some caveats to using this. Now I've been talking for a few minutes. I just want to quickly give me a shout out. I'm Erik. If you don't know, I'm a developer advocate. I'm a front-end engineer for AWS, but recently I moved over to a developer advocate role, so I'm doing a little bit of both, which is awesome. I get to go to conferences and talk to people like you, and also talk about AWS Amplify. Quick plug for that. That's a set of tools to help front-end developers create full-stack websites. We have a Vue library, a React library, Angular library, and we also are we're friends with the Nuxt team, so there's some stuff happening with there. So we are trying to definitely be very involved with the different ecosystems. And then I have a YouTube channel called Program with Erik. You can search for that. And my Twitter handle is ErikCH. All right, so here's the goals that we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at why use server components at all, why you guys are here today, and if this is something that you might be interested in. What it's not. It's very important to put some caveats on what it's definitely not. You should not use it for. How to set them up. We're going to look at some code examples because we're here and everybody loves code. We're going to looking at slots and fallbacks and future improvements, and then a couple of bonus sections and some other experimental functions that we can look at. So features. So why should you use server components? Well, lower bundle size. I've heard some talks earlier today talking about bundle size and how to lower them. But if you use server components and you're using packages that connect to your SQL database and you're doing all these other things, those will not be included in your client bundle that's shipped down to the client. It will only be on the server side. So anytime you're using these server components, you can kind of think of them as API routes. Like that, those JavaScript isn't going to be shipped down. So you can get quite a bit smaller bundle size. This might be obvious, but since we're running code on the server, we don't have to worry about secrets being leaked to the front end. That's actually, I heard recently on the Next side, there was a scenario where that actually happened. But if you're using server components, you know that this code is run on the server, and there's nothing to worry about there. So that's a good thing to remember. It kind of reminds me, too, like people who haven't used Nuxt before, they don't realize in the first render, things run on the server side, and then gets hydrated and you run the client side, so you have to be aware of that. But if you're using server components, it doesn't ever run on the client side. It's all on the server. So you can put some secrets in there and they'll be secure. This kind of seems counterintuitive, but you actually don't even need a server. So the default way you can use server components is that if you run them in like a static site generated way for your app, the server components will actually prefetch data. They'll be included in the bundle. They'll do everything for you. So you can actually don't even need to have server side. You can mark a component as server side, statically generate your site, and then they will still be prefetched and still work as you expect them to. And most importantly, they can look like normal components. You got routing, you can share state between them, but there is some kind of functionality. So there's some things you can do. And by the way, Daniel Rowe, he helped me with these slides, and he made sure I mentioned this too, because they are kind of like normal components. But there is a catch, right? Like if you have been using this, it's not perfect. It is experimental, so you imagine that it's not going to work perfectly. So obviously, since we're running the server, we don't have the document object model. We don't have window. You can't use that. You also don't have any lifecycle hooks if you're using some of those. There's really no, and I put a caveat here, there's no interactivity. So if, like, the example you probably see in the docs every day, if you go to Nuxt or Vue, is the counter. You have the ref, put the equal to the counter equals ref, and then you do ref.value, and you're incrementing on every click. That doesn't work. Ref reactive does not work on server components. So you kind of have to shift the way you're thinking about if you want to use them. And Nuxt link doesn't work, which is, there is a GitHub issue on it. They are trying to find an interactive way. I'm going to talk about this later in some future roadmap. But you won't be able to do routing the way you think you want to do routing. And there's some examples out there how you do routing in server components. It looks kind of ugly. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can do it. I would recommend it if you want to just play around with it, though. It's not too bad. All right, so how do you set it up? All right, so the first thing you do is do .server.view on your components that you want to make server. You also have to enable the experimental feature in Nuxt, in the Nuxt config file, by adding the component islands. So in summary, looks like this. So in your define Nuxt config, you put experimental, do component islands true. And then your components will essentially look like this. So they have this user profile.server.view. You just add the extension server.view, and then voila, they are a server component. Just like everything else in Nuxt, it's pretty straightforward. And then there is advanced use cases where if you really want to, you can determine how the server component loads on the server side, and then you can make a separate component to show how it works on the client side. So you can have that option of like writing code for server and client. The problem with doing it this way, and when I was testing this out, is you get this nasty error called hydration mismatch in your console, and things do not work right. So I think this needs a little bit more work, but it is possible. And here is an example of using it in an app. So you can pass props to it like you would do any other Vue component or Nuxt component, and you just use it as a regular component. And voila, your app bundle is smaller. But you guys are probably thinking, went over like how there's no interactivity, like how am I even supposed to use this? I can't, like maybe if I have a very static site, doesn't change much. But there is a few ways to get around it. And of course, this is slots. So it does support slots. I like this graphic because I'm from Nevada, and I see these all the time everywhere I go. All right, so we have a default slot, not much to it. But this would be like, this is how you would pass information. So anything between the opening and closing brackets would go into the default slot. And so essentially you can have interactivity in here. You can put a button in ref and reactive, and you just define a slot inside your user profile, and it would work. You can also do name slots, in this case top. You can do scope slots too, so if you want to pass information back up, works as you expect it. So this is interesting. So I was testing this feature out. I did a YouTube video on it. And one of the problems I was finding is that if you have a server component and it's loading some data from like a back end, and it's taking like 10 or 15 seconds, it would actually, as of now, until this fix, it would just halt the browser from loading. It would just kind of wait there until this promise got resolved, and you would have problems with it. And so Daniel Rowe actually saw it, and he said, I have a fix for that. So he, in like 5 days, he created a fix for it, and he added this new feature in. And he called it non-blocking server components. And so it had a few things to get it working. First, you have a lazy prop, and you have a fallback. And this is just a named slot called fallback that's defaulted in there. So what you would do is you would add in, let's assume this is our user profile or a server component that we set up in our app, and we have this await call, and it's taking a long time. We probably should have used $fetch, now looking at this. But anyways, so it's taking a little bit of time to go in and get the information. And we need to wait here. And what we can do is we pass in the profile name, profile, and we put lazy true. And the template fallback is the loading async component. And I do see one other problem with this. I just told you you couldn't do ref and reactive in server components, and I have it in there. So that is a mistake. Oops. But you would have any kind of wait function. You would just assign it to a variable. And so this is how you do it. So this would, if you put lazy equals true in your server component, and you have this fallback, you would have this loading async component here. And what would happen is, as it was loading, it would just kind of give you this loading async component message until the promise resolved or failed. And so it's right there. All right, so there's some other future roadmap to this feature that I think is very interesting that I wanted to pass on. So first, if you are interested in this, try it out, open some issues in the GitHub on Nuxt. They're really looking for people to test the feature out and get feedback on it. But here are a few things that they want to do. So first, they want to add in some more interactivity to these components within server components. They want to add Nuxt link. They want to just make sure that you can more manipulate it and work it better with it. They also want to have deeply interactive components. So a scenario that you might see is that you have a server component, and then it might have some child components that are also server, but they want to make sure that that works correctly. And right now, if their server component does, but you can't add client components. So there's some problems when you start nesting components together, and they want to do some updates to that. And they need to do some slot refactoring to stabilize the API for other remote sources such as CMS. So Nuxt content is a use case that they really want to add in and make sure it works great with server components. So they're looking at that use case and how to add in CMSs and stabilize it so these server components work really well. So we have a few more minutes here, so let me talk to you guys about some other experimental features. So a couple of people mentioned this. I think I heard Alex mention it earlier, inline route rules. This is a really neat feature because you can define route rules as the page level using define route rules. Looks like this. So we have define route rules. You can put pre-render too. So instead of doing it in your Nuxt config in every single route that you have, you can then just set this define route rules. You can do pre-render, incremental static regeneration, static site generation. So you can do it, and you can do it in a sort of hybrid mode that you want in your Nuxt app. I think it's kind of just a little easier to do than putting in the Nuxt config. I guess it depends on your preference. I haven't used this, but client fallback enables the experimental Nuxt client fallback, which is a component for rendering content on the client side if there's an error in SSR. So certain browsers, certain situations, you might have SSR fail, and having this client fallback, you can put certain messages and shows different things if that happens. And I'm really excited about this one is the Vue transition. This is available today. It enables Vue transition API integration with the client-side router. So you can do all your fancy Vue transition things. And I thought maybe I could show a demo of it. Let's see here. All right, so here is a site that is created with the new Vue transitions experimental Nuxt feature. Have you guys, anybody used Vue transitions or seen demos of it? I think a few people, yeah. It's pretty neat. So you could see a little bit of the way it does transitions here. Kind of moves a little bit different. The transitions are really nice. There's a lot of really cool transitions you can do from this Vue, from this way of this experimental feature. If you go into some of the code, it uses Nuxt link, uses this promise here, and has this Vue transition inside here, in this H1, the CSS here, the style scoped. All right. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but I will put a link in my Twitter if you guys want to have more information about Vue transitions. All right, thank you, guys, for coming to my talk, and I appreciate it. And reach me out, ErikCH on Twitter, or I'm at Program with Erik, and Erik.video. And I guess I have time for some questions, too. I'm done a little early.
When we are talking about the non-block server components, when we are at the lazy part and the waiting for the fallback, waiting for the loading to finish when we have the fallback, how is it then different than an SSR component that's waiting for hydration? Thank you.
I see. So yeah, in Nuxt, yeah, so this server component, like if you're going from route to route, if you go to a route that has one of these server components that has lazy true on, you'll see a banner that says it's loading, and then you'll see it appear as soon as the async component is done. So that's a little bit different there than the hydration that you see when you're going to a normal SSR route or SSR app and you're loading it for the first time. Hello.
Thanks for the talk. It was pretty great. Personal question would be, where would you see Nuxt server components shine? Like, do you have a use case where like, that's a no-brainer there, you would use that, given everything works flawlessly?
Well, the example that I've seen is with Nuxt content. That seems to be the place that I've seen people use it. That's the one I've seen some examples of. So, and maybe using it with other CMSs, I think that's probably a good place to start right now and see how that works for you.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. No problem. Alex?
Thank you very much, Monsieur Erik.
Thank you.